I gave the heirs exactly what they asked for. Their lawyers saw the water bill and froze. They say a fool and her money are soon parted. So, when I sat in a glass-walled conference room in downtown San Francisco and signed away my right to a $12 million Napa Valley vineyard for absolutely nothing, my stepchildren looked at me exactly like that, a fool. I kept my hands steady as the ink flowed onto the heavy parchment. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just handed the Montblanc pen back to their high-priced estate lawyer and offered a polite, grieving smile. Julian, my 42-year-old stepson, let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a week. Beside him, his sister Chloe, 38 and dressed in mourning couture that cost more than my first car, reached over and patted my hand with a pity so synthetic it practically squeaked. They thought they had won. They thought they had finally excised the gold-digging stepmother from their bloodline's legacy. What they didn't know, and what their $2,000 an hour lawyer had failed to catch in his arrogant haste, was that my late husband Richard was a man who understood the soil of California better than anyone. And more importantly, he understood exactly what his children were. The scent of funeral lilies was still clinging to my black wool coat when the ambush began. Richard and I had been married for 19 years. We had built oak and iron estate from a struggling, overgrown patch of ancient Zinfandel vines into a premier boutique winery. For nearly 2 decades, my hands were as stained with purple juice and California dust as his were. I ran the tasting room, managed the payroll, and sat by his side during every brutal harvest. Julian and Chloe, meanwhile, lived in San Francisco and Los Angeles, respectively. They visited twice a year, once for the annual release party to drink free wine with their wealthy friends, and once at Christmas to collect their checks. During the grueling 11 months of Richard's battle with pancreatic cancer, I slept on a cot in his hospital room. Julian sent edible arrangements. Chloe sent text messages. But the moment the monitor flatlined, they descended like vultures catching the scent of copper on the wind. The meeting at their lawyer's office was supposed to be a simple reading of the will. Instead, it was an eviction. Eleanor, Julian had started, leaning back in a leather chair that swallowed him, trying to project a patriarch's authority he hadn't earned. We all know Dad wasn't in his right mind toward the end. The medications, the pain. He made some estate planning choices that just don't reflect his lifelong intentions for his children. Their lawyer, a man named Sterling whose smile never reached his eyes, slid a massive binder across the table. He explained, in a voice dripping with patronizing calm, that the will leaving the estate entirely to me was highly contestable. He cited mental incapacitation. He threatened years of probate litigation that would freeze the winery's operations, bankrupt the estate, and leave me destitute. "We don't want to see you out on the street," Eleanor, Chloe added, adjusting a diamond tennis bracelet. "We are willing to be generous. If you sign over the main estate, the label, the tasting room, and the production facilities to us, we will let you keep the life insurance. And," she paused, as if offering me a kingdom, "we'll deed you Lot 7. Free and clear." Lot 7. It was a rugged, 40-acre parcel of steep, rocky hillside that sat at the highest elevation of our property. It was unplantable. Too steep for tractors, too rocky for vines, covered in scrub oak and wild mustard. To a layman, it was a piece of useless dirt that just happened to have a breathtaking view of the valley. To Julian and Chloe, giving me Lot 7 was a joke, a way to make themselves feel magnanimous while tossing me a scrap. "Just the insurance and Lot 7? I asked, letting my voice waver perfectly. "But Richard and I built this business together. Where will I live?" Julian sighed, the heavy, burdened sigh of a man dealing with a slow child. "The insurance is $500,000, Eleanor. You can buy a nice condo in Santa Rosa. Leave the farming to us. It's a young man's game anyway." I looked down at the mahogany table, letting my silence stretch until the tension in the room was brittle enough to snap. I thought about the secret folder Richard had handed me 3 weeks before he died, his frail hands gripping mine with a surprising, desperate strength. "Let them take the vines, Elle," he had whispered, his voice raspy from the oxygen tube. "They only look at the fruit. They never look at the roots. Let them take it and wait for summer." I looked up at Sterling. "Where do I sign?" I asked. Julian's eyes widened in shock, followed immediately by a naked, ugly triumph. They shoved the papers toward me so fast I felt the breeze. I signed away the oak and iron label. I signed away the historic farmhouse. I signed away the 80 acres of prime Cabernet Sauvignon vines. When I walked out of that glass building and onto Montgomery Street, the San Francisco fog felt like a baptism. I was free of them, and the trap was perfectly legally set. The transition was brutal. Julian and Chloe gave me exactly 14 days to clear 19 years of a shared life out of the farmhouse. I packed Richard's books, my clothes, and our photo albums into a rented moving truck. I bought a quiet, modest little house on the edge of Calistoga, just a few miles up the valley. From my back porch, if the morning marine layer wasn't too thick, I could look across the valley and see the jagged ridge of Lot 7 rising above the oak and iron estate. Word traveled fast in Napa. The valley is a small farming town dressed up in luxury, and the vineyard managers talk. I heard everything. Julian had fired our seasoned vineyard manager and brought in a consultant from a corporate agricultural firm. Chloe had hired an interior designer to gut the historic tasting room and turn it into a minimalist, sterile lounge designed entirely for Instagram. They were spending money like water, taking out heavy lines of credit against the land to fund their massive rebranding effort. They were throwing extravagant parties, boasting about how they were bringing oak and iron into the modern era. But farming isn't about modern eras or marketing budgets. Farming is about nature, and nature doesn't care about your Instagram following. Winter passed with a beautiful, heavy rain, lulling them into a false sense of security. Spring arrived, and the vines woke up, pushing out brilliant green shoots. Julian was practically strutting through town, wearing expensive boots that had never seen mud, bragging to anyone who would listen about the record-breaking harvest he was anticipating. But then came June. And in Northern California, June brings the dry season. The rain stops, the soil cracks, and the sun beats down without mercy for 5 long months. Napa Valley survives this brutal cycle because of irrigation. Without it, the vines stress, the grapes shrivel into raisins, and the crop dies. It was a Tuesday in mid-July, during a blistering 100-degree heatwave, when the first domino fell. I was sitting on my patio, sipping iced tea, when my cell phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I knew the prefix belonged to the County Water Management Board. I let it go to voicemail. 2 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time it was Julian. I watched his name flash on the screen, letting it ring 5 times before I calmly slid my finger across the glass. "Hello, Julian," I said, my voice as placid as a still pond. "Eleanor," he barked, his voice tight with an edge of panic he couldn't quite hide. "We have a problem with the irrigation system at the estate. The main pumps are pulling air. The reservoir is dropping too fast, and the secondary well isn't turning on. Who did Dad use for pump maintenance?" I took a slow sip of my tea. Richard used Miguel from Valley AG, but Miguel retired. "Have you checked the flow meters on the ridgeline?" There was a long, heavy silence on the other end. "The ridgeline? The pumps are at the bottom of the hill, Eleanor." "What are you talking about?" I smiled, though he couldn't see it. Here was the fundamental ignorance of the city boy playing farmer. He thought water came from the pipes, just like he thought money came from a bank. "Julian, the lower pumps only move the water from the holding tanks. The actual source, the deep artesian aquifer that feeds the entire 80-acre parcel, is located under the granite bedrock on the ridge. On Lot 7. "Okay, fine," Julian snapped, the impatience roaring back. "Give me the gate code to Lot 7. I need to send a crew up there to manually override the pump switch." "I can't do that, Julian," I said softly. "What do you mean you can't do that?" "The vines are in heat stress. If I don't water them in the next 48 hours, I'm going to lose 30% of the crop. Stop playing games, Eleanor, and give me the damn code." "It's not a game," I replied, leaning back in my wicker chair. "You don't have the legal right to access that infrastructure. And more importantly, you don't have the legal right to the water." "Are you insane?" Julian laughed, a harsh, desperate sound. "We own the vineyard. Riparian rights are tied to the land." "Riparian rights apply to surface water, Julian." Like a creek, I explained, reciting the exact words Richard's water rights attorney had taught me. "But groundwater, percolating groundwater, is different. 3 years ago, when you and Chloe tried to have your father declared medically incompetent so you could seize the winery early, it broke his heart. It also made him realize he needed to protect me. So, he hired a specialist in California water law." I paused, letting the silence hang. In California, Groundwater rights can be legally severed from the surface estate if it's done correctly. Richard drilled a new, massive industrial well on Lot 7. He legally severed the appropriative groundwater rights from the lower 80 acres and bound them entirely to the deed of Lot 7. Then, he transferred ownership of that infrastructure to a holding company called Ridge Aquifer Management, LLC. And who, Julian breathed, his voice suddenly very small, owns that LLC? I do, Julian. I am the sole managing member. When you forced me to sign over the estate, you were so busy looking at the tasting room and the vines that your lawyer never checked the utility easements. Oak and Iron doesn't have a water source anymore. It hasn't for 3 years. Richard was leasing the water from my LLC to the winery for $1 a year. But since you voided all of Richard's existing operating agreements when you took over, that lease is expired. The line went dead. He hung up on me. I set my phone down on the glass table and watched a hawk circle lazily on the thermal drafts above the valley. The trap had sprung. It didn't take long for the panic to set in. 2 hours later, a sleek black SUV tore up my gravel driveway, kicking up a cloud of white dust. Julian and Chloe spilled out of the car, followed closely by Sterling, their shark of a lawyer. Sterling looked considerably less smug today. His tie was loosened, and he was sweating through his expensive dress shirt. I didn't get up to greet them. I just poured another glass of iced tea and waited. You're committing extortion, Julian screamed as he stomped onto my porch, his face purple with rage. I've got crews out there watching the leaves turn yellow. You are intentionally sabotaging our business. Good afternoon, Julian. Chloe. Mr. Sterling, I said, ignoring the outburst. Chloe looked like she was going to be sick. Without her Instagram filters, the deep lines of stress around her mouth were glaringly obvious. Sterling stepped forward, putting a restraining hand on Julian's chest. Eleanor, let's all take a breath. I've reviewed the county records. While it appears your late husband did execute a severance of the groundwater rights, doing so with the intent to defraud the heirs of the estate is a massive legal liability. If you don't turn those pumps on immediately, we will file an emergency injunction and sue you for every penny of lost revenue. I couldn't help it. I laughed. It was a genuine, bubbling laugh that felt like medicine in my chest. Sue me? Mr. Sterling, you are the one who drafted the settlement agreement. Do you remember the clause you put in on page 42? The one you insisted on to make sure I could never come after the winery's profits. Sterling's face went the color of old cement. He remembered. You wrote a blanket waiver, I reminded him gently, stating that the heirs and the estate release Eleanor from any and all claims, liabilities, or obligations tied to the agricultural operations of Oak and Iron. You also explicitly accepted the property, as is, whereas, with all faults and utility configurations. You waived your due diligence to get me out of the house in 14 days. You legally indemnified me from exactly this situation. He's a malpractice suit waiting to happen, Julian snarled, rounding on his lawyer. You told me the property was clear. It was clear. Sterling shot back, losing his professional composure. Who severs their own water rights? It makes no sense. It makes perfect sense if you know your children are greedy enough to steal a farm without knowing how to farm it, I said, my voice hardening. The polite widow was gone. Richard knew you wouldn't look at the dirt. You only care about the label. You thought I was just the help. You thought because I didn't wear a suit to work, I was stupid. But I sat in on every meeting Richard ever had. I know how this valley works. Chloe stepped forward, tears pooling in her eyes. Eleanor, please. We took out a $6 million loan to renovate the tasting room and update the production facility. We used the vineyard as collateral. If we lose this harvest, we default. The bank will foreclose. We'll lose everything. Please, you love Dad. You can't let his legacy die. His legacy isn't that brand, I said, looking her dead in the eye. His legacy was the soil, the community, and me. You didn't care about his legacy when you gave me 2 weeks to pack up 20 years of my life. You didn't care when you fired Miguel, a man who worked for your father for 30 years, just to save a few bucks on a consultant. You want water? You can have it. Julian's head snapped up, a glimmer of desperate hope in his eyes. You'll turn the pumps on? Of course I will. I run a water management business now. I sell water. I reached into the folder sitting on the table next to my tea and pulled out a single sheet of paper. I slid it across the glass toward them. Here is the new commercial supply contract for Oak and Iron Estate. Julian snatched the paper, his eyes darting across the text. As he read, the last remaining color drained from his face. His knees actually buckled, forcing him to catch himself on the porch railing. You can't be serious. This is a joke. What is it? Chloe demanded, grabbing the paper from his shaking hands. She gasped. $25,000 a month? Plus a premium per acre-foot? Eleanor, this will bankrupt us in a year. Actually, I corrected her. That is exactly the current market rate for emergency supplemental water delivery in Napa County during a declared drought. It's perfectly legal, heavily documented, and non-negotiable. You can sign the contract, or you can watch the vines turn to kindling. The choice is yours. Sterling looked at the contract over Chloe's shoulder. He closed his eyes and slowly shook his head. He knew I had them dead to rights. There was no legal loophole, no injunction that could force a private utility owner to provide free water to a commercial entity without a contract. They were trapped in a cage of their own making, locked from the outside by a man who had been dead for 6 months. You planned this, Julian whispered, staring at me with a mixture of hatred and absolute terror. No, Julian. Richard planned this. I am simply executing his final wishes. They didn't sign the contract that day. They spent a week frantically calling hydrologists, drilling companies, and other lawyers. They found out exactly what Richard had paid a small fortune to confirm. Drilling a new well on the lower 80 acres was impossible due to the bedrock shelf, and the county wasn't issuing new agricultural drilling permits during the drought anyway. By day 8, the vines were dropping their leaves. The clusters of tiny green grapes were shriveling into hard, useless pellets. By day 10, Julian drove up my driveway alone, looking 10 years older, and signed the contract. But the damage was already done. The exorbitant cost of the water, combined with their massive loans and the reduced yield from the heat stress they allowed to happen, broke the back of their financial model. They couldn't pay the interest on the tasting room renovations. When the harvest finally came, the crop was a quarter of its usual size, and the quality was abysmal. Word gets around in the wine world. Distributors dropped their allocations. The new, sterile tasting room sat empty. 14 months later, Oak and Iron Estate went into foreclosure. The bank auctioned it off on the steps of the Napa County Courthouse. Julian and Chloe didn't attend. I heard through the grapevine that Julian had moved to Austin to start over, and Chloe was living in a cramped apartment in Burbank, dodging creditors. I did attend the auction, though. I stood in the back, wearing a simple linen dress and sunglasses. Because the property legally had no independent water source, it was essentially a dry, 80-acre parking lot in the eyes of commercial buyers. The big corporate wineries didn't even bid. The property was functionally useless. I bought it back from the bank for pennies on the dollar, paying in cash from the life insurance and the exorbitant water fees I had collected from my stepchildren. The day the deed was recorded back into my name, I drove up the winding dirt road to the main house. The fancy new tasting room looked ridiculous, but that was fine. I could fix it. I parked my truck and walked out into the rows of ancient Zinfandel vines. They were dormant now, resting for the winter. I bent down, picked up a handful of the rich, dark soil, and let it sift through my fingers. I took out my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. Miguel? I said when the gruff voice answered. It's Eleanor. How would you feel about coming out of retirement? We have a lot of work to do. As I stood there looking up at the rugged ridge of Lot 7, I felt the first cool drop of winter rain hit my cheek. Richard had been right. They only looked at the fruit. But as long as you protect the roots, the vine will always come back to life.